Okay, friends, we are beginning with program number 3 in Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 1, Section 3, the 6 Stages of Discipleship. And here is part 1 of that, Section 3, page 680, and going on, let's see, maybe to 686. We'll see. Part 1. The world today is going through a preparation period and an interlude of adjustment to the new world and the new order which is coming into being, the Aquarian Age, of course. This new world is verily a new creation. There is a group creativity involved, very much in Aquarius, and with its activities, the masters are today engaged, working as always, at least at that time, through the medium of their disciples. They will be working directly on the physical plane, but even then, it will be through their disciples and initiates that they will do, let's say, much of their work. Some, of course, they will handle directly by themselves, but it's usually of so esoteric a nature that the disciples could not understand it. In this preparatory period, the masters are today occupied, among other things, with preparing disciples for constructive work, for service, and eventually for initiation. And notice how the one precedes the other. That is, service work, even between initiations, precedes the possibility of the next initiation. They are consequently occupied with forming new groups of disciples, as DK did, who can gradually be integrated into existing groups, and let's say on the inner planes also, and be available for world service. It is planned to do this on a large scale because of world need and the willingness of world aspirants to take the personal risks incident to this preparatory work. And risks there are, both external, as we see, and internal risks as well. So, the forming of new groups of disciples on a large scale, available for world service, and planning, trying to meet the need, and how we notice that the word willingness is used, which is a precursor to the divine will. First comes the willingness. As a matter of fact, when we want to know what will is, we have to think of willingness quite a bit. The acceptance, the acquiescence, we say, yes, I will take this on. Even Tuya so often mentions Mary, the mother of Jesus, as the archetypal disciple displaying willingness to undergo that particular burden. As we would expect, DK is full of rules. He must have somehow a very strong Saturn in his astrological makeup. And of course, if what I think is correct, that there is a very high third ray involved in his manifestation, that would involve Saturn. There are certain very simple rules to which I would refer, and which form a foundation of truths which you already accept as necessary to spiritual advancement. And these are the accepted requirements, and, you know, we can almost say related to the accepted disciple and the accepting disciple. I should have put them in the right order. Accepting disciple, and later the accepted disciple. First you have to accept, you have to acquiesce, you have to perform before there can be that kind of recognition that comes from the master and makes some kind of bond with you, which is not easily dissolved. So these are the accepted requirements and are recognized as present in all whom the masters take in hand and weld into their groups for service. These types became accepted disciples by that recognition by the master and by their willingness to be trained and the willingness of the master to train them, having maybe, as Alice Bailey used to joke, maybe I'm third best. The masters, for some reason, couldn't use the first best or the second best, maybe because of their attitude, but they settled upon the third best, and that was I. Well, she, you know, had that kind of humility, maybe overdoing it sometimes. DK sometimes gently criticized her for not accepting her role and playing it down, you know. So here are these maybe foundational acceptances. Number one, and you know, I'll try to make it big because always when you try to go back, you need a landmark, a little bit of a landmark to orient yourself. The recognized need to tune in, as far as the individual aspirant can, on world need as it is emerging. Well, just the way awareness of need is one of the higher psychic faculties, so and can be applied from individual to individual. It can be applied from individual to group and from group to group. So tuning in, this is required. It must be borne in mind that the requirements for those who will work at this bringing into being the new world will be of a different nature in many ways from the past. Well, the requirements of discipleship have been changing. And that's one of the reasons I think that DK had to write these bridging treatises to help make people aware of those changes, new requirements. So this must be carefully borne in mind. The world need must be approached mentally and spiritually and not emotionally. So many aspirants and would-be disciples are emotional. They shrink from the facing of existent facts and approach problems from their own preconceived ideas of service and their own established idealisms. Apparently, that's not the way to do it. But we are expected, if we're not, mentally polarized, at least we must be, for a great deal of the time, mentally focused. It's a lesser stage. So tuning in on world need, and maybe, if we paused even to ask ourselves right now, at this time, what we consider to be the great world need. We might find, well, you will find what you will find, but we might find that international cooperation between nations is extremely important instead of the constant contention and the constant ulterior motive to achieve hegemony, one nation over another, and to assert that hegemony. It's not useful anymore. Humanity is one. And somehow we have to express that, realize that in our international relations, but of course also on a lower turn of the spiral, in our individual and group relations, so that throughout humanity, the oneness of humanity begins to dawn in the heart and its upward extensions. The achievement, then, number 2, of a finer sense of values. And, so many of us are operating according to our sense of values, which is not adequate to the demands of the time. We have to change what we desire, that towards which we aspire. And those aspirations and ideals that we hold have to change. Rest, now, this is a tough one here. Rest, amusement, idleness, argument, and criticism have no real place in a disciple's life for the next few years. Well, this was written in the 30s. But you wonder, why should it not be applied right now? The situation is still dire, and weaponry is increasing in its lethality. Who has the strongest laser that can knock planes out of the sky and so forth? Who has the fastest missile that can be upon you even before you know it? Who doesn't care about the harmony between nations and therefore contributes to that situation in which humanity is living, as DK calls it, in an armed camp, in which situation an explosion is inevitable. A sane handling of the physical mechanism will be required. If you drive yourself too far too fast, you will collapse and shorten your term of service. Plus a divine indifference to personal feeling and health reactions. Complete dedication to the meeting of human need and utter consecration to the plan. These requirements are intensifying, we see. And although it was in the years preceding the onset of the war that the discipleship books were written, I don't know how long they were continued, because they came out in segments, But anyway, how could we differ with this advice now? A sane handling of the physical mechanism, not too much, not too little, the golden path of moderation with respect to the handling of the physical mechanism, plus a divine indifference to personal feeling. As long as the plan is served, the personal feelings regarding the incidentals are relatively unimportant and not part of that new and finer sense of values. And divine indifference to health reactions, which will be there. And many people, they turn to hypochondria and they nurture, he was pointing out, so-called heart difficulties and other health difficulties. And then it gets even more intense. Utter consecration to the plan. We read recently, I think in Letters on Occult Meditation, what it means to live the consecrated life. Well, we have to continue to be fed by these words. There are so many of them and so easy to forget and not to perform. Intelligent cooperation with all whom you recognize to be senior disciples, we might say, without jealousy and ambition, awakening, adequate care to take right action in circumstances so your efficiency is not impaired. And one of Alice Bailey's keynotes was skill in action. I mean, she met so many people and had to deal with so many types. She really needed that. The conservation of energy through silence, which basically means appropriate speech in the right context at the right time. And through that constant radiation, which is based on self-forgetfulness. That is what is asked of the world today. That is what is the hierarchy expects. And this is what will eventually open the door to initiation. Well, he says, we well know these things, but it certainly helps to be reminded, doesn't it? Because, we don't live up to all of them. So, utter consecration to the plan, but it doesn't stop there. It goes on and asks for intelligent cooperation, and it asks for our ability to recognize senior disciples when we encounter them and have to work with them. I'm sure we all recognize DK as a senior disciple and others, without belittlement, jealousy, ambition, awakening. So, basically this involves humility, or an adjusted sense of right proportion, and being careful in circumstance so that we can serve with efficiency. Our radiation is very important, but we can't be stupid about it. We have to be intelligent in our service, and service is demanding, and it is a pull upon our energy. So Occult Silence, as given in the rays and initiations at the very beginning, I think it's the 4th requirement, and it has a lot to do with speaking within the ashram as if within the ashram, speaking to people as if within people, and not mixing 2 or 3 different types of speech that belong to different levels, which would only cause confusion and rebellion and, resistance. That door, that will eventually open the door of initiation, achieved through the grasping of one's brother's hand, and not the attempt to ambitiously walk through the door oneself. That door has to be opened more widely at this time by the accepted disciples of the world, maybe using the Dina books. Especially he gave us Dina 1, Discipleship in the New Age, Volume 1, to attract people into the ashram. At this time, by accepted disciples of the world, so that more and more of the human race may easily enter. Self-interest. This is the statement that is so important. Self-interest will not open it. Self-interest will not open the door of initiation. I guess, we could repeat that to ourselves over and over, as there are people so eager, and even subconsciously eager, to pass through that door. And they do that in an ambitious manner, which is not even recognized by themselves. All right, so we're talking here about accepted requirements. And once DK begins to talk about them, they seem to mount upon each other and be demanding. Recognition of need. We have the consciousness of the need to tune in on world need. So that's number 1. Yes. And number 2, a finer sense of values, which turns out to have many parts to it. And then point 3, also so part 3 here. What else of these acceptances? The development of a fluidity of mind and attitude, which will recognize the fact that though the plan stands, techniques, presentations, idealisms, and methods must necessarily change as we have the new discipleship now, and from person to person, and not being rigid about the insistence that people do things in our way. So a certain fluidity of mind and not the rigidity of the concrete mind. This is not an easy thing to do. The plan, as I have outlined it to you in the past, was but a skeleton outline and simply an underlying basic structure that we have to realize so we don't dogmatize about it and hold it concretely, rigidly. It was the steel scaffolding, and of course, thus it is strong, of the new world to be, as regards that part of it which you could aid in materializing. Now, obviously, he's suggesting that we can't aid in materializing every aspect of the new world to be. Certain things are just beyond us. But, again, humility, knowing what our limitations may be, knowing where we fit in the whole scheme proportionally, an adjusted sense of right proportion, so we can actually do something of value without underperforming or attempting to overperform, which will be bound to fail. It is not easy for the average person to be fluid and to change details and methods in relation to that which has been taught in the past and about which he has evolved definite. There's a rigidity about definiteness, definite and distinct ideas. Are you therefore prepared to throw these overboard and work in the way which will meet the new world need under the incoming influences? The change in discipleship methods, certainly a significant change from some of those at that time who had been raised up in the theosophical movement. And even now, we face a new series of bridging treatises towards the knowledge of the new age. And we may hold overly much to what has been presented in the first and second of the series, though if the third series is what it will purport to be, then there should be no fundamental contradiction. When all kinds of new presentations come along and they are glamorous and illusory and contradict the solid material that has been given, then a note of caution is advised. We do not accept. The disciple upon whom the master can most confidently depend is the one who can, in periods of change, preserve that which is good and fundamental while breaking from the past and adding to it that which is of immediate service in the present. So this tells us something about our usefulness if we will adopt such an attitude. And it also tells us something about something here about ray 4, through which no dangerous gaps appear between phases of the teaching. The good from the past and the coming good are both preserved harmoniously in the face of each other. An attitude of spiritual compromise is right, needed. Again, ray 4, ray 2, and very rare to find. Most of the things about which there may be argument, remember, he said, a waste of time, and contention among disciples concern methods and relative non-essentials, and they deal with points of organization. Remember what he says about organization, that organization and criticism accompany each other, but not organism. They are not so important as the inner unity and the ability to concede where no wrong is involved and where a fellow worker fails to see the point. So disciples need to see to it that they do not hinder by any form of self-assertion, which is inevitably this is personality assertion. And I want to keep that purple. Purplish. Or by the imposition of their own ideas, or by any authoritarianism based on past procedure. Well, we've always done it this way. Who are you to come along and tell us that we must do it in some new way or even suggest it? So ponder on this. Or by the imposition. Master DK also, though a master, does not impose his ideas, demand that his ideas be carried out in the way that he presents them, though it would be the part of wisdom to follow those presentations. But we don't always have that wisdom when we need it. And there were those who even rebelled against what Master DK had suggested. And then, they ended up sadder but wiser. So this is the idea here about spiritual compromise. Kind of putting it in the ray 2 color, and the idea that arguments, and certainly if like you're me, or you are like me, or like I am, you've been involved in quite a few. They have not been concerning really important matters. I think we can argue extensively about the status of the one about whom naught may be said and know nothing. And just a waste of time, Well, there are certain of us who have fallen into that trap. So points of organization are not items about which to fret as long as the inner union is preserved. Well, can we remember that when the moment comes and we feel that we must engage in argument and assert our point of view? Can we remember? The disciple who is sure that he is always right and who is confident that his interpretation of what is needed is infallibly correct and the others must be molded into cooperation with his planned procedures, can greatly hinder the good work. Well, it's a warning, isn't it? It is a warning. And inevitably, we will have the opportunity to find ourselves in situations where this warning has to be observed. The task of the modern disciple is to sense the need and then to meet it. And this again is part of the new emerging technique of invocation and evocation. We don't have to marshal others into like-mindedness with us. So here DK gives us what's called a new technique. Of course, it's almost 100 years old. And by now you would think that with our experience, we would heed the warning signs. The life of a disciple is a gradual but steady moving in towards the center, and accepted disciples are definitely part of the hierarchy. Now, that is an important statement. Accepted disciples are definitely part of the hierarchy. Within that blue circle that I've sometimes shown you, even those who are aspirants are included, but DK is going a step further and defining um, from a new perspective. So that means that the groups that he gathered around himself as the center of the ashram and modified as he went along, that those personnel in those groups were definitely part of the hierarchy. And therein lies a tremendous responsibility. Now, let's understand what the hierarchy is, because maybe it's different than what our images of it may be. The hierarchy is a place, point of tension really, of fusion of all souls upon the higher levels of the mental plane. And insofar as a person comes under soul impression, then soul control and final identification with, and I would add as, the soul, just so far does he move towards the center of fusion. A place of fusion of all souls upon the higher levels of the mental plane, and to a certain extent upon the Buddhic plane, more and more recently. So we want to move inward towards the core, inward towards the core. And from that place, of course, better to serve. As your love for humanity increases and your interest in yourself decreases, so will you move towards that center of light and love where the masters stand in spiritual being. And I would say, within the cosmic ethers, they are particularly standing in spiritual being. It's not easy because disciples are individualistic. They are naturally concerned with their own progress. Their eyes are too easily focused upon the little self. And he's asking here for true decentralization in order to move inward. Later, we will consider the various stages of discipleship, but in the meantime, it is of value for you to focus your attention upon the relation of the hierarchy to all accepted disciples, which some of these groups were. It's one thing to know, perhaps, and hypothesize that one is an accepted disciple, and then to, in a way, forget it and lose oneself in utter consecration to the divine plan and in service to the world. And all this through interest in humanity, love of humanity. Remember that the Christ first noticed the arcane school when it began to involve itself in the problems of humanity. Something like, what is this group that is interesting itself in our work? That's the work of the hierarchy, to help humanity solve its problems. It is just because you are beginners that the whole subject evokes your deep interest. The beginner is full of questions upon all sorts of subjects. The trained disciple is so preoccupied with the plan, so infused with love for his fellow men, that his entire orientation is towards the service of the plan and not towards his own individual progress or his master. Well, that puts things in proportion, doesn't it? The beginner, and who is to say that we can escape from that appellation, is interested in himself or herself so often. And it takes a while to decentralize and to outgrow that attitude. Have we outgrown it? Have we? the closer he gets to the center and towards the master, the less attention the master pays him, and the less he is occupied with thinking about the master. In the early stages, he perhaps necessarily thinks much about his relation to the hierarchy, to the master, to his own soul. Well, the closer he gets, the less attention the master pays him. It's exactly the opposite of what the beginner might think. When I get closer, the master will pay more attention. So in the beginning, he thinks much, perhaps, and DK says perhaps necessarily, about his new relations to the master and to his own soul, even. In the intermediate stage, he is occupied with the achieving of a sense of proportion and a right inner adjustment, so that he faces two ways, and each way sees the same vision. And we can, here are 3 points of assessment for us. With what are we preoccupied? Do we find ourselves in the beginning phases? Do we find ourselves in the intermediate stage? And then in the final stages, when he is the disciple who is also the master, note that his consciousness is absorbed into the will of the Creator. I suppose in this case, we might say Sanat Kumara. His attitude is one of unchanging love, and his work is that of radiation, a radiation which evokes activity in others, initiates a response from his fellow men, and carries the plan, the next step forward in meeting the immediate need of humanity. So, what is that intermediate stage? The high disciple, relatively, but maybe high still in the sense of probationary initiation, or maybe the 3rd degree has been taken. It's very intermediate between the 1st degree and the 5th. But now, finally, and even a disciple is a master, or a master is a disciple. Well, I guess as disciples, we have to master something. But okay, then we are entirely absorbed in unchanging love and in the work of radiation, which evokes the right response from others. So there is a kind of creative work going on, and DK was demonstrating this work when he worked with his groups, and maybe in many other ways that we don't know anything about. In this creative work, he says, to which I have referred above and to which all disciples can contribute, the work and the task of the masters is to project into the world those thoughts and those formulated divine ideas, those concepts and significances, something higher than a concept, which embody at any one time the immediate plan for humanity. So that's where it comes from these sources. And we are aware that the masters are responsible for the appearance of many progressive ideas, good ideas at the time, ideas as thought forms, which the world needs. Maybe it's true. Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come, and the masters make sure that when the time has come for an idea to be an actuator of action, they get behind it and project the necessary thought forms that will help that process occur. So we have to be as outposts, potentially as outposts of the master's consciousness. We have to be aware of what the master through his ashram may be projecting. And it will always be to meet human need. And that's our task too, to recognize the need to meet human need. A master therefore searches for those minds which are sensitive to his plan. And that's interesting. He is not primarily occupied in looking for people who are good, so-called. Self-forgetfulness and straight kindness means ever harmlessness, and that connotes the utmost good. So, what is this method of selection that the master engages in? He selected, 51 people with whom to work in his work with Alice Bailey. Who knows what else he has selected in different work. He doesn't have to do it all with Alice Bailey. A master, therefore, is looking for like minds, looking for like minds, because then those minds will be able to further the purposes of his ashram. He is not primarily occupied with looking for people who are good, so-called. So it's a little different approach, isn't it, than we might have thought if we were still subject to the old method of training. Be good, and the master will love you and select you, and you will be more and more proud as a result. It's very different. Part of the new discipleship. Okay. He seeks for those type of people who can respond in unison with one sound, unison, to the aspect of the plan for which the master is responsible, and for those who can be taught to subordinate their personalities to its requirements, the requirements of the plan, those aspects of the plan for which the master is responsible. He's looking, as a president looks for a cabinet that will help him bring forward his particular orientation and ideas, or at least not drastically oppose everything he says or waste time in rebellion. So the master is, in a way, choosing his lesser cabinet. They have no selfish purposes and desire nothing but only to aid the master and those senior disciples who may be working under his supervision at some aspect of the plan. We might say relatively something happened there. Relatively high initiates. This involves, as I have pointed out, their training in adaptation, in the recognition of true values, in the fluidity of ideas, and selfless work for their fellow men. So, it's not that you simply join an esoteric school, like the Arcane School or Moria Federation or, whatever school for esoteric studies, and suddenly the master will be accepting you. It's not that at all. You have to pass his eye and his assessment as to your usefulness to his projects. So this is whom he selects. And then, of course, we want to avoid the glamour of special selection. It's a sixth ray kind of glamour and affects many in this field. So we have to be flexible, have to have truer values than in the past, have not to be limited by the concrete mind and the authority of past methods, and above all, selfless work for our fellow human beings. A master's group is not a place wherein disciples are taught to make their personality adjustment and soul contact. It is not a place, a point of tension where character discipline is imposed and right relations between the personnel of a group of junior or senior disciples. The rules for instituting soul control are ancient and well known. They have to be practiced for long periods before the stage of accepted discipleship is reached. Note this. So it's not kindergarten, is it? A master's group. Much has to be done before that, right? All these adjustments of ideas, the kind of moral emphasis is assumed if one is admitted into a master's group. It's for the work of the master and making the master's work a possibility. being an instrument in his hands. The disciplines of character that should have been dealt with on the earlier, let's say, the probationary path, have to be somewhat achieved before it's possible for entry. Of course, there were people in his group who were violating some of those principles through gossip and criticism and overly impositional attitudes and, ambition. And he called them on it in very skillful ways so that they could rapidly change those attitudes. The contest with the lower nature and the building of the needed qualities which are essential to the world worker are the normal theme of life and experience and of life experience. And therefore, humanity in its intelligent brackets is steadily undergoing this training. So that's not enough to qualify oneself as an accepted disciple and to enter the master's group. The capacity to work in collaboration with others at some directed piece of work is part of the evolutionary process itself and is inevitable. So, this is why those normal issues around being a good moral individual are not sufficient to bring us into a master's group as an accepted disciple. When we have those indications that acceptance has come, whether through the dream experience or meditation or thought form of a master or even an interview finally in the master's ashram. So this is part of the new discipleship. It's really new discipleship in a new age, really. And yet now it's 80-something years old since this was presented. He says, I want to make entirely clear to you that the practices of a purificatory nature and the cultivated right habits of thought, which are the major undertaking of an aspirant's life, are not the major undertaking of the disciple. And we might almost say the true accepted disciple. They are regarded as incidental and foundational, and they concern the handling of the personal self and are the task of the individual soul. They are carried forward and are carried forward under soul supervision and not, because it's not necessary, carried under the supervision. They are not under the supervision of a master. What, therefore, is the contribution of the work of the disciple? So this is such an important discrimination so that we can clarify maybe the old theosophical approach where you have to, as it were, in the simple sense, be good, and the master will approach you. There's more to it. It doesn't mean that you should not be good, but you carry on your own training under the supervision of your own inner self. That's just an ongoing way of life. and you accept that. The inner monitor has always to be alert. And you, as the soul in incarnation, are the inner monitor of personality tendencies which may go astray. But, you know, uh, except under rare circumstances, you don't hire the head of a department in a university to come and always teach the beginners. There may be an occasional lecture for inspiration, but the higher classes have to be taught by the master, and he can leave to others whom he has trained the task of teaching the newer entries. We find this, of course, in the university. I mean, how many of us have been taught in the beginning by teaching fellows? I know I have. The head of the entire department maybe rarely appeared, but not on any consistent basis. The group of every master, let's see here. I may not be able to finish this before my next obligation, but we'll see. The group of every master is distinguished by its thought content. So we're talking about contribution and work now. Contributed by the disciples and used by the master in his work for humanity. This is if we can create something, polish it up, it's in good shape, give it to the master, he knows where to apply it. Therefore, the thought life of every disciple must be conditioned by three factors. Because this contribution of a disciple is made in the world of thought. Okay. So number one, the thought life of the contributing disciple. Of the disciple contributing to the ashram. So it's distinguished by its power. Again, I'll make that as strong as I can. And this is dependent on right spiritual instinct, right understanding, and interpretation of ideas, and correct formulation of these ideas. So we're contributing. We have to, otherwise there's no point in us being part of an ashram, and a master would not select us, just as in the new esoteric schools, unless you have some capacity or talent along some line of thought or expression. We will not be accepted into the school. So power is number one, and that's ray one, of course. Then purity is the ray two factor. And probably, maybe I should have used more of a ray two color, which I will do. By its purity. And this grows naturally out of a growing capacity for unlimited, non-separative love, clear vision, and the unimpeded flow of soul force. And these are Ray 2 qualities. And the contribution is also concerned with correct precipitation, which takes us into the realm of the third ray and the subsequent rays that are rays of attribute, the manifestational rays, we might call them. So the thought contribution, power, purity, precipitation. Notice the mnemonic here to help us remember. The thought contribution involves so far power, purity, and precipitation. We see how DK helps us memorize, helps us learn correctly. This precipitation of thought is due to clearly directed intent, will, purpose, and intent, to comprehension of the purpose for which the disciple exists, and an increasingly intelligent participation in the master's creative activity. These are all third ray factors. Intelligence is the ray of creative mentality. DK prefers a name something like that. He has that word creative when it comes to the describing the third ray. So power, and the reasons for the power: right understanding, right spiritual instinct, right interpretation, and correct formulation of ideas. Purity, growing out of capacity for unlimited, non-separative love. Not easy. Clear vision, the unimpeded flow of soul force, and then precipitation through directed intent, comprehension of the purpose for which a group of disciples exists, and an increasingly intelligent participation in the master's creative activity. The group of a master, and he made, was in the process of making quite a few groups, is a focus of power built up by the master in three ways. Okay. And what are these ways of power? And I'll just somehow bring that power in. How does he build up the power? Okay. So he's really explaining what his group should be. How does the master build up the power of an associated group? And number one, by the potency of his own thought life, evoked by his response to the united hierarchical purpose and a growing ability to respond to Shambhala. If he can respond to the Chohan, who's the head of the Ray ashram, he is, in a way, responding to Shambhala. So how else does he build up the power of the group that he has gathered around him? By his ability to integrate the center of power, his group, for which he has made himself responsible, into the immediate activity of hierarchy. Now, this integration suggests to me a kind of a second-ray activity, not that intelligence is missing. Okay? And number 3. How else does he build up the power of his group, his own thought life, and his ability to integrate the center of power, which is the group, into the immediate life of hierarchy. And finally, by his wisdom in the choice of collaborators. Now, this is often what we call selectivity. Um, and is related to the third ray, to ray 3. His wisdom. So it's a blend of ray 2, wisdom, and selectivity. A blend of the two. And wisdom on ray 2 added. His group of disciples will be effective in world service and useful to his superiors, just as far as he employs judgment, Libra, ray 3, in gathering together the men and women whom he is preparing for initiation. And every disciple, true disciple, is being prepared for initiation. And regarding judgment, we can put down Libra and ray 3. One of the early problems with ray 3 is in the selectivity factor, throwing together those who suited each other not. But later, more intelligence is involved, especially when the seventh ray related to the seventh sign Libra is employed, because then a real appropriateness can be utilized. So I use the word initiation here because I want all disciples who read my words to realize that initiation is not something which they undergo as a result of any training which they may receive from a master or because they have reached a certain stage of advanced evolution. Now, does that Does that confuse us? Does that connect with what we think? What is it instead, if it is not perhaps what we have so often thought it to be? How many adjustments of ideas we will pass through in this new presentation of discipleship. Rather, it is a process of continuing integration into centers of force, into a master's group, into the hierarchy as a whole, and consciously and as disciples attain adeptship into Shambhala. That's what initiation is. Ever integrating into larger and more intense centers of force. Continuing integration into centers of force. Not some accolade because you're good, because you're advanced, because you've been trained, although you have to be good. You have to be somewhat advanced, and you do have to be trained, but that's not that alone. In a deeper sense, continuing integration into centers of force. You can be part of something deeper and more intense than you've been part of up to this time. You can see, therefore, that a master can be greatly hindered or aided in his work for humanity by his choice of disciples, and so can we by our choice of co-workers. They should ponder on this fact, because in so doing, the process of decentralization will proceed more rapidly, and their love and service will consequently increase with a paralleling certainty and surety. Caution every step of the way. The magician is cautious. The disciple is cautious. It's not simply a matter of running through a process. Discrimination at every step. Discernment as often as possible. Response to group vibration. And deep knowledge of the divine plan through spiritual telepathy. And we certainly, don't want to be a hazard, a liability to the master, which inevitably we are until we achieve real mental polarization. I would have all disciples grasp this clearly and so get into their consciousness the idea of contribution. We used to have in the university psychology courses a quality of cultivation and a quality of contribution. And that's self-explanatory, really. One we need to develop, and the other we have developed to a degree which makes it giveable, shareable. So contribution is the word. When we think of the ashram, watching the thought life with care, as in the 15 counsels given in the Treatise on White Magic, page 473. Build in this, cast out that. Watching the thought life with care, so that there may be in it that which will increase the potency, ray 1, and the purity, ray 2, of the ideal, which at any time is dominating the group, and which will be of such a quality that it will precipitate that pool of thought with which all disciples can be on rapport and entitled to use. So basically, he has come back to this mnemonic potency, purity, and precipitation. He's come back to these. That pool of thought. And that's what, so these three must be in the mind of the disciple as he or she seeks to contribute to the thought content of the ashram. Yeah, just pause a moment there, What is it in your thought life which is really contributing to the ashram's potency, its purity through outgoing love, and its power to precipitate the content within the ashram that must at this time and in this space-place be precipitated. I would have you also remember that a master's group is the center of energy into which the disciple is precipitated, and that its effect upon him as a personality is illimited, like the Om, and evocative of higher states of consciousness. And until we are ready, we cannot be precipitated into that center of force, center of energy, point of tension. So it's not just what we can get. I guess this is the whole point. We're there for service. It's what we can give. Eliminative and evocative. These are two E's again. And he's so, constantly presenting mnemonics to help us really remember. These two words cover the life of every disciple. They are singularly descriptive of what is happening to humanity in these days before the externalization and reappearance, as the process so long foretold of externalizing the hierarchy, foretold for millions of years, and restoring the mysteries upon the outer plane, is slowly proceeding. And that will require, as in humanity in general, a more intense process of elimination and evocation in the life of the disciple. We're living at that time. That a process long foretold is really occurring. And it will make such a difference in the response of humanity. The hierarchy is essentially the group of the Lord of the world. It is his ashram. In this statement lies the enunciation of a relatively new truth as far as human knowledge is concerned. Now, hierarchical knowledge has known this for a long time, of course, because they are in increasing rapport with Sanat Kumara, the Lord of the world. Before the hierarchy can work more openly, I always have trouble there with my cat chewing mouse. The cats must know the name, mouse. They eat the wires, you know. Anyway, before the hierarchy can work more openly and with fuller recognition by mankind, there must be the elimination of all hate and the sense of separateness. We're in the process right now of proving that hate and separateness just don't work. And maybe there's not much time to prove this to be the fact. And here's the other word, evocation. And the evocation of goodwill and of right human relations as the result of the activities of all disciples, and that's our job, to see to it that there increases the presence of goodwill and right human relations. Elimination and evocation. Again, the two words. The widespread recognition of the evil of the present war. So some of this, in fact, was written, I suppose, in the late 30s and 40s, early 40s, and of errors in every national policy make it possible to produce a general attitude which will clear the way for the needed right adjustments. It is the same process of awakening and of constant strife which disciples experience in their individual lives and which prepare them for the stage of accepted disciple. Humanity is being prepared by the drastic experiences through which it is passing at that time and still today. The recognition of evil, what it is. Sometimes people, it seems today, have forgotten, but many have remembered. The vortex of force into which the disciple is plunged by right of his own effort and the decision of his master gives him the needed training in the handling of those energies which are the substance of all creation, thus enabling him to contribute to the creation of the new world. And DK hits these themes over and over again. Its contribution that occurs when we think in terms of the ashram. There is always a new world in process of forming. The keynote of the work of every disciple can be summed up in the familiar words, "Behold, I make all things new." And I'll just make that still bigger. Behold, I make all things new. So by our own decision, our own effort, and the Master's decision, we get the needed training because we are plunged into the vortex where that training can occur. Okay, friends, well, we have reached then the end of this program, which is program 3, and we're basically, we've done from, 680 to 686, which is where we will begin next time. Time to get the old computer fixed here. We'll begin at 686, program 4. Okay. And we're in section 3 of the book, and we're beginning with part 2 of section 3. And he's carrying on these preliminaries before he actually gets into the discussion regarding the 6 stages of discipleship. So let us continue together. This is an important section. It is already written out on Makara in a detailed written commentary, but I have found that it is sometimes useful for those who want to study the book to be able to sort of carry this around on their iPod or whatever else they use, move around and be able to hear it instead of just sitting straight at the computer. So I'm doing some of these for that reason, and also because different ideas come out when you are speaking than when you are writing. So lots of love and many blessings. We'll see you before long, and we'll see when I can begin again, which is still the XX of February 21. And whether it's tonight or later, we will see. Bye for now. See you soon.